Phantom coaches were common in tales from the 18th and 19th centuries, the heyday of the use of coaches, you might say. The stories usually involve a local landowner riding around at night in a black carriage. The horses that pull the coach can be fire-breathing or headless. Black dogs might accompany them for extra visual impact. The stories also come in a range of flavours. Some coaches act as ill omens, with family members keen to avoid seeing them for fear of bringing death to the door. Others see phantom coachmen terrorise pedestrians with merry abandon, and yet others more act as anniversary markers for deaths or disasters. Let's delve a little deeper into the phantom coach as a figure from folklore, in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. It is now November, so we are starting the Folklore of Transport month, which is going to have a little bit of a twist, just basically to be able to fit everything in that we're going to do. So this week we're going to have a look at phantom coaches, and you might be like, how has that got anything to do with transport? And I just thought it was a nice segue from all the ghost stories that we had last month for October, and it's also because a lot of these coach stories do also have tales in them about coach travel themselves. And then next week we're going to have a look at some of the folklore of the London Underground, because it's such a weird system, so why not? So anyway, we are looking at phantom coaches this week, and I thought we might as well just jump in. So nowadays we do have an entire plethora of transportation types at our disposal, but obviously in earlier centuries choices were far less plentiful, with your options often limited by your class and income. Experts date the arrival of the coach in England to anywhere between 1555 and 1580. It certainly wasn't available to everyone, and it still took time to travel around the country. A journey of 60 miles between London and Cambridge still took a day by coach. And coach travel was also dangerous, with coaches overturning on bad roads, and the possibility of being held up by thieves remained a very real problem. Yet within folklore, it is the phantom coach that we find with more regularity, and the law of seeing one seems to outweigh the law surrounding the use of real coaches. As I said in the intro, phantom coaches were common in tales from the 18th and 19th centuries, and in a lot of ways we can see this as essentially being the heyday of their use, because obviously from the 19th century onwards you start to see an uptick in other forms of travel such as rail. Now, the stories about the coaches do usually involve a local landowner. They're often riding around at night in a black carriage, and there's often horses pulling their coach, which can be fire-breathing or headless. Both of these, I dare say, would stick in your mind. And black dogs might accompany the coaches for extra visual impact. Furthermore, the stories do cover a whole range of types. So we have coaches as ill omens, we have coachmen actually terrorising pedestrians, and then we do have these anniversary markers as well. So we're going to start off with ghostly cover stories, and in the early 18th century, Reverend Richard Dodge was the vicar of Talland in Cornwall, and he was also considered a ghost layer to the extent that a vicar from a nearby parish called him in to help, because it seemed that Lanreath, the neighbouring parish, was afflicted by a phantom coach pulled by headless horses, and only Dodge could help. So Dodge and his fellow vicar, Reverend Abraham Mills, held a vigil one night on the moor. Despite it being a common location for sightings, they still didn't see the coach, so the men decided they would head for home and try again on another night. But for some reason, Dodge's horse didn't want to follow the road that he'd chosen. She ignored his commands and kept trying to turn back. Eventually, Dodge gave in and turned her around. There on the moor was the phantom coach, and the coachman was standing over something that was lying on the ground. And Dodge realised the thing lying on the ground was actually Mills lying prone, so he sprang into action. Now, the coachman apparently took fright at the sight of Dodge and jumped back onto his phantom coach, and the coach and horses were never seen again. But the funny thing is, far from applauding Dodge's ghost-laying prowess, locals in the 1970s thought that Dodge must have been in league with local smugglers. Here, the legend of the phantom coach worked to scare away people who might stumble across the operation at night. Now, we'll never know if Dodge really was involved with smugglers, but it is also possible that he simply scared away actual smugglers. And there was a precedent for smugglers doing this, because smugglers used the brandy bottle tree in Kinkerswell parish for brandy smuggling. and they painted a hearse and their horses with luminous paint, leaving the heads black so the horses would appear headless in the dark. Then they gallivanted around the area to scare locals into staying indoors during their peak hours of operation. Now, we do obviously have to wonder if they created the idea of phantom coaches or if their ploy worked because there was already a legend of phantom coaches in the area to piggyback on. Of course, not all coaches are seen. Many of them are actually heard. And WFD Wismas Kane relates a story of an encounter with a phantom coach at Mohill Castle in Leitrim. And here, the family were all sitting in the drawing room when they heard a carriage and horses approach the house and stop outside the door. They unbolted the door, but there was nothing outside when they opened it, and Kane noted it couldn't have been a passing carriage as the drive was a dead end. The following day, a woman who lived opposite the gates said she'd seen the black coach driving up towards the castle, and apparently this particular coach often had a headless coachman driving it. And this idea of a phantom coach that is heard but not seen also appears elsewhere. The rector of the Diocese of Cashel wrote to St John D. Seymour and Harriet L. Nelligan about his experiences living in the rectory there. He and his wife heard the sounds of a coach, often several times a night between 8 p.m. and midnight, and then nothing for months. In his account, the rector notes that they're nearly a quarter of a mile from the high road, so again it can't be noises from passing traffic. And the sounds nearly always happened when they were sitting in the dining room. The rector also reported seeing a phantom trap turn up his driveway and then disappear at a bend in the road, though he didn't know if it was the same vehicle that he heard while he was inside the house. Now, the coach associated with Bungay Castle in Norfolk is slightly different, because witnesses either see or hear the coach, never both. So what essentially happens is the coach roars forth on particular nights of the year, with the horses breathing fire while smoke pours from their nostrils. And people have heard the sounds of the coach and horses as it rumbles down Biggards Hill, the noises growing louder as the invisible coach passes, and then the sounds fade away. Alternatively, people see the coach glide by, but no sounds are heard. Here, the horse's hooves strike sparks against the ground, but the whole vision is entirely silent. And this is really unusual because coaches are usually either seen or heard, so the idea of some witnesses seeing while others hear is a fascinating one. But obviously there is also this idea of the coaches being a harbinger of death, and there's a legend from Lincolnshire that a man was walking along the road to the north of Scorby village. He saw a phantom coach and horses drive by, and for some reason better known to himself, he decided he was going to follow it. Now, the coach actually drove right into the nearby lake, and the man even followed the coach into the water where he drowned. Apparently, you can actually hear the coachman laughing on a dark night. Obviously, there's no way to substantiate this story, because how could anyone know what the man saw that led him into the water, but it is a local legend nonetheless. Obviously, in this story, the coach acts as both a harbinger and a cause of death, and elsewhere, simply seeing the coach can be an omen that someone will die. Now, it is important to point out that the occupant of a phantom coach will very rarely offer anyone a lift, but if they did, the would-be passenger would do well to refuse, lest it spells their doom. Now, I did mention earlier about the idea of phantom coaches also replaying disaster, and there's a pub in Coventry called the Phantom Coach. Found on Fletchamstead Highway, it's named for a local legend, because in the 19th century a coach disappeared one night in the area. Many people believe that the coach ended up in the nearby marshes and sank, leaving no trace. And a ghostly coach has been seen in the area, which leads some people to think that it's just simply replaying the disaster. Now, according to the legend, the coachman drove the horses too hard, which is what led to the crash. And people still hear thundering hooves and coach wheels on the road on dark nights. And one witness in 2018 even saw a stagecoach with its men wearing top hats. Back in the 1940s, a couple who lived nearby heard the sound of horses galloping past their house at midnight. They looked out but saw nothing in the street. They mentioned it to one of their neighbours, who then said it was a bad omen, and the Coventry Blitz began a few months later. There is also a theory that the pond into which the coach crashed was actually drained, and the pub now allegedly stands on the site. And this story really does help to support the contemporary fears about the dangers of coach travel, the idea that you could be involved in an accident so bad that you actually ended up being lost without any trace at all. Now, obviously, we do have famous sightings of coaches, and they're not necessarily famous coaches, but rather the occupant is famous. So a phantom coach and four in Norfolk passes over the bridges at Aylsham and Beelaw every year on 19th of May, and it's believed to be Sir Thomas Boleyn, and he's actually driving over 11 bridges on the anniversary of his daughter Anne's execution. Some believe that Sir Thomas is thus cursed for his role in Anne's demise, and this is why he has to do it, whereas other versions of the story say he must pass over 12 bridges. Other legends claim that Anne Boleyn herself drives down Blickling Parks Avenue in her coach once a year. She holds her head in her lap, and her horses and attendants are also naturally headless, and this one is acting as both an anniversary sighting and a reminder as to her fate. Lady Jane Grey likewise rides in a phantom coach in Bradgate Park every New Year's Eve or Christmas Eve, and the coach either takes her to the ruined mansion or to Newtown Linford Church. Now, some reports actually claim the 4 horses are headless, while Lady Jane again carries her head in her lap. Neither New Year's Eve nor Christmas Eve marks a specific anniversary for Lady Jane, but obviously they are notable dates in the folklore calendar. And finally, the ghost of King Charles I apparently drives around the grounds of Court House in Painswick in a phantom coach, and as you would expect, he's also headless. And the last thing we're going to have a look at is the Headless Coach, because St John D. Seymour and Harry L. Nelligan differentiate between phantom coaches and headless coaches. So for them, phantom coaches are simply ghosts, much like the replay of the disaster in Coventry, whereas headless coaches are death omens. And in this regard, they act somewhat more like banshees, being attached to specific families. So in their collection, True Irish Ghost Stories, a man named T.J. Westrop relates a tale about his great-grandfather who lay dying in 1806. Now, his sons waited for the doctor to arrive when an immense dark coach swept into the drive. They assumed it was the doctor, but the coach didn't stop at the door as they had expected and rather continued along the avenue. The sons ran after it, thinking the doctor had missed the turn. Yet the coach vanished into thin air despite the fact that the gate was locked. Sadly, the old man died soon after. Westrop then went on to advise people to open all gates if they saw or heard the coach. If so, the coach would only predict the death of a relative who was far away, because it wouldn't stop to pick up a member of the family at the house. And indeed, Seymour and Nelligan relate another tale, this time of the McNamara family. And on December the 11th, 1876, a servant did his checks on the grounds. He heard a coach rumbling along the back avenue. Given the late hour and the part of the estate, he knew it must be the death coach, because there was no other reason for a coach to be on that particular part of the grounds. So the servant ran along the avenue, throwing open the gates as he went, and he managed to open the final gate and throw himself face down just as the coach rolled by. They then received news that Admiral Sir Burton McNamara died the following day in London. So what do we actually make of phantom coach stories? Well, Jacqueline Simpson and Jennifer Westwood note that some of the phantom coaches are associated with the rich and powerful. And in these stories, these landlords continue to terrorise their tenants even after their deaths. Meanwhile, the coachman may take on a wild hunt role, gathering souls of those who are out after dark. Elsewhere, the coaches act as death omens for those unlucky enough to see them. This does make me wonder if their employment by smugglers was a clever one, giving people a reason to stay home at night. Now, surprisingly, while sightings are less common, they haven't died out altogether, even though the coach is no longer a fixture on our roads. And this does make it all the more surprising that the phantom coach is often heard and not seen. After all, how many people in 2021 would recognise the rumble of the wheels and the thunder of hooves? Is it a folk memory lurking in the backs of our minds, embedded there by the dread of the phantom coach? Or have we just seen so many period dramas that we're more familiar with antiquated transport than we think? One thing's for certain though, if you ever do encounter a phantom coach, don't accept any offers of a lift. So what I want to know, as always, is if you've ever seen or heard a phantom coach. Clearly I want to hear about it. If you know a story of somebody else has told you, that's also cool to pass on as well. So you can leave any comments for the blog post that this episode is attached to, which is in the show notes below. Or again, you can tweet me, Facebook me, whatever. Again, the links are below, because I am fascinated to know if anybody has actually had any sightings in more recent years, or if it's something that's perhaps started to die out just a tad. And in addition, if you are interested in these kind of stories, then I did share a short mini episode about the Coach of Bones in Devon with my Patreon supporters, and you can get access to that at the £1.50 a month tier. Obviously, there are different bonuses available at different levels of support, and you can support the podcast for as little as £1 a month, which is pretty much the lowest that I think I can actually offer. Obviously, any income that comes via Patreon, or indeed the coffee link that is below if you want to buy me a coffee to say thank you for this episode, all goes back into essentially paying for the podcast, so it is what helps keep it going. If you would like to support the podcast but financially it's perhaps beyond you at the moment, then you can always leave a review. They're always welcome, or indeed just tell a friend, and that is also useful as well. So thank you in advance for that. As I say, next week we are going to have a look at the folklore of the London Underground, because it is an incredibly strange place at the best of times. And we're also going to be looking at the folklore of seafaring the week after that. So this is all planned out. I've actually got my calendar well into 2022 now, because I've also got some listener requests as well that I want to address. So if you do want to make a request, please feel free to use the link below, and I'll see about getting to those in the new year. But without any further ado, thank you so much for listening. Thank you in advance for any coffees that you might like to buy me, if that is indeed something that you'd like to do. And I'll see you next week when we have a look at the folklore of the tube. Cheerio. Well, thank you for listening, and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going, and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu, and I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going on to next.